Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. Just to let you guys know, with today's episode, we had a little bit of a glitch with the recording process, and there's a couple spots throughout the episode, not many, but a couple that we missed about 5 to 10 seconds worth of dialogue. So we wanted just everyone to be aware of that up front. It's not something wrong with your system. It was a mistake on our part, and we apologize for it, and it will be corrected in the future moving forward. So without further ado, here's today's episode of Father and Joe. Hello and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface 6. And as you're listening to it, if you're listening to it the day that it initially released, this episode will be released on July 26th. And the reason we highlight that, normally don't, is that July 26th is actually the feast day of Mary's parents. St. Joachim and St. Anne. They are saints, correct? Okay. Yeah. See, the little basic things that I just assume, but actually it brings me to a secondary question I had about that is, when I think about saints, they're all basically born after Jesus, or one of the disciples is always my thought of when I think about saints. And I think that that's probably flawed, but as I think about it, St. Paul seems like he was born, lived during the times of Jesus, and so on and so forth. So I don't really have any thoughts of that, but nonetheless, we wanted to have this discussion today because obviously being Mary's parents, they are the grandparents of Jesus. And grandparents are obviously an important relationship that many of us have in our lives, but not one that I think we ever really drilled down before and had an actual episode about. So I wanted to give you the floor today, Father, to kind of set the table here and correct me where I'm sure I'm already wrong and we're only 90 seconds in.
Well, saints are those in heaven, simply said. And some of those saints we celebrate as examples for us. And even saints like John the Baptist, for example, who died before the death of Jesus, or St. Joseph, who also died before the death of Jesus, are two obvious examples. But we also celebrate the Old Testament prophets. Even Adam and Eve are considered saints as they were raised from Jesus and the harrowing of hell on Holy Saturday. So Joachim and Anne, the parents of Mary, are also considered saints and are celebrated as such. We only celebrate feast days for saints or blesseds, but those who are recognized as being in heaven and worthy of our emulation. And so July 26th, traditionally the feast of St. Anne, her husband Joachim was added to that as part of the liturgical reforms after Vatican II to highlight his role. He had a different feast day, I believe. But anyway, to put them together and celebrate grandparents and celebrate a marriage. We're doing this podcast also not long after, just a week or so after the feast of St. Therese's parents, who are the first couple to be canonized in an official canonization process as saints, as a married couple. Other husbands and wives have been canonized individually, but they were canonized actually together as a married couple. So one of the things that it shows us is the emphasis in our time on marriage, first of all, and the goodness of marriage as a vocation to holiness. And so I think that's worth acknowledging to begin with, the importance of marriage, and that is a real path to holiness. It's not sort of like the default vocation that those who can't be priests and religious end up in, or something like that, which sometimes is in the popular mindset. But marriage is really a beautiful vocation and a challenging one, and one that unites the married couple with Jesus in the sacrament of marriage, and one that is lived out as a way of the cross. And there are some marriage rituals that include holding a cross together during the saying of the vows, for example, an acknowledgement that you will be a cross for me and I will be a cross for you. In marriage, when we talk about in good times and in bad, for poor, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, whatever the actual, I always forget which is which, the popular one and the actual Catholic one. But anyway, we're recognizing that marriage is difficult, that it's a real way of love that is purified by times of difficulty and requires self-sacrifice. And so all of that is beautiful to recognize. Saints Joachim and Anne celebrated together as a married couple not long after the parents of Saint Therese on July 12th, who are also celebrated as a married couple, can take our attention, first of all. And then kind of the secondary point of, or another point of them being grandparents. So they're the grandparents of Jesus. And in that way, we're recognizing not only his parents, not only his nuclear family, we might say, but he mentioned sometimes noted as the brothers of Jesus, but the word is the same as cousins of Jesus, who include probably some of his own disciples who were likely the children of his father's brother, that is to say, Joseph's brother, Alphaeus. And so we have James and Judas and Joseph and whichever, and Mary is the wife of Alphaeus or the wife of Clopas. And so the family of Jesus, the extended family of Jesus, also plays an important role. He didn't just drop down shrink wrapped out of heaven as an adult on the way to the cross. Jesus grew up in a family with parents, Mary and Joseph, and with grandparents, Joachim and Anne, and maybe also Joseph's grandparents. Heli or Jacob is the father of Joseph. We don't know anything about his mother, at least that's not such popular devotion. But in any event, Jesus grew up in a family with the extended family, those different relationships. He grew up in a village, and people knew him. And so all of those dimensions of our life are there in the life of Jesus. And then it gives us a chance to reflect a little bit on the role of grandparents. Grandparents are, especially in our day, often the ones who hold the faith. A lot of times, parents have lost the faith or become nominal in faith. It's been grandparents many times that have insisted on a baby being baptized. That's a slightly more extreme. That's not normative that parents would lose the faith and grandparents would keep it. But certainly we have that continuity of faith that passes through generations, and we do hold each other when the winds and waves of our times are different than the ones before us. I think of my own parents who grew up in the 40s and 50s and were really inundated with a much more Christian culture in our country. My brother and I grew up in the 70s and 80s when our country was becoming much less Christian. And so a lot of times those grandparents rooted in more Christian culture are able to hold across a generation that's influenced by a much more secular culture some of the values of the past. We have that organic continuity between generations. And then we also see the role that grandparents play. And I've watched many young married couples struggle when they've moved away for a variety of reasons and are trying to raise their children and have nobody to babysit. Grandparents are these wonderful built-in babysitters who are able to take care of the little ones, and the grandparents rejoice that they have little babies to hold. And they also rejoice that they can give the babies back to their parents. And the parents rejoice that somebody else can hold the little babies for a period of time. And in the absence of grandparents, it seems to me that things like nannies or other healthcare or childcare, rather, organizations have become much more prolific. But what grandparents can do and helped with when families were living together under one roof, for example, has often been outsourced to semi-professionals, you might say, who don't bring as much love because they just are not as connected to the individual, to the children. So we see that role with grandparents as well. And then just a last word, and I'll let you get in a word edgewise. But Pope Francis has dedicated a number of catecheses to the elderly and has mentioned many times the role of grandparents as the keeper of wisdom, as the roots in history and tradition and culture. The grandparents root us in the long vision. They are able to see across many generations. They're able to see things that have been tried and failed. They're able to hold on to the values of old. And young people, on the other hand, bring a certain energy and innovation, which is also important and moves us into a new space. But the fruitful dialogue between the young and the old, between the grandchildren and the grandparents, is necessary for the healthy growth of a culture, which doesn't just sprout a lot of new directions that have no future or no hope, but are rooted in the wisdom of the past and the tradition of the past. And so Pope Francis has really made that a keynote of his pontificate, to emphasize that conversation between the grandchildren and the grandparents, that they really learn to love and to listen to each other and to grow in relationship with each other.
And if you think about that from a process, so to your point of grandparents knowing knowledge and learning, my thought is that each of us naturally have thought differently than we did when we were younger. I mean, that's part of growing up, not just the maturity that we kind of discussed before about delaying gratification, but we also start to get this better appreciation for thinking for the long run, for thinking for things that are beyond just the immediacy of now. I look at my son, who's obviously less than a year old. His entire life is basically devoted for the next 4 minutes. And longer thinking than that just doesn't exist. And as I look at society, because a big part of this has been the Pope's talking about how we need families. We need families to become better connected. We need to not outsource, as you just said there, and paying people to try to replace what our family is, because at the end of the day, it doesn't work as well. Yes, you can have an individual who has compassion and can be a very good teacher, but there's no way that if you think through your own life that every single teacher was as good as your parents in terms of their ability to love and care about you. It's just not possible. It's a difference between being yours and being a job. And that's just doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes it life. You're always going to care more about your own kids than the kids you're paid to take care of. And that's just part of life. So when I look at that and I start to think about this type of thing, it really makes sense that we should be called to learning from those who have spent more time on this planet and have seen results of this idea that's getting pushed down the pipeline is something that sounds enticing, but isn't really a good idea in the long run. And where you see a lot of divides about this is, as you said, is with the religion element. We have people that say, I'm not getting any value out of this because it's telling me stuff I don't want to do when I'm a teenager, but my body's telling me I want to do it, but you're telling me not to. I don't want to listen to something that's telling me not to. And, kids have this mentality of simultaneously the future doesn't matter and they will never die, which is really contradictory if you think about it for like 4 seconds. But it's also the way that we are inherently as a society. And I really think that that's something that as we get older, we think about more. And obviously, I am not at the age of grandparents. I'm at the age of first experiencing what grandparents are through the parents' perspective, of my perspective. And it is remarkable to me about how much things seem different when you look at them through different eyes. Because at least in my family, I am not the first to bring a grandchild into the world. My younger siblings have already done that. So not only did I get to see how my parents were with their kids, but how they are with mine, and how they are doing something which I think is what we all should do, is they treat each kid essentially on their own kid's terms. They don't have a blanket, we're just treating you all this way, but we treat this one that way, this one that way, and this one that way, essentially based upon their needs at the moment. And seeing that, it's just something that made me think about. Obviously, I only have one child, so I can't think about how I'd raise a different one until they're there. But it's a thought process about how we shouldn't treat everyone as cookie cutter and how we should treat everyone as individuals. Now, they might be wrong and I'm learning the wrong way, but I get the feeling that there's a lot of logic and thought into doing it that way. This thing.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful that you get to see your parents become grandparents and some of the shift that takes place in that, and the way that they love their various grandchildren is edifying for you. It gives you an expectation that loving individually and seeing each child as his own person, her own person, is the ideal, and you can see that lived out from the perspective of your parents' love. So they're teaching you even without saying anything, teaching you simply by the example of how they love. And I know, I think with grandparents too, uh, parents get kind of a second chance. There's a certain irony of God entrusting, especially now that I'm in my mid 40s, thinking of raising a child when I was 20 is hard to imagine. And one friend of mine said, I often tell God, what were you thinking entrusting infants to 20-year-olds? Why did you think that was a good idea? And it is crazy. Like people that you hardly trust, you can't get car insurance, but you can have a child. It's like amazing what what the Lord has done and what's really has been normative throughout history. I mean, we don't have as many 20-year-olds having children now, but it certainly has been normative, even younger than that, especially for the woman who's often a couple of years younger than the man, traditionally speaking or historically speaking in marriage. So, um, but now, grandparents sort of get a second crack at it. It's like, now I know, they're thinking, now I know how this turns out. When you love them this way, well, you see how they grew up and some of these things turn out. And so we can love the babies in a way that we didn't know how to love them as parents. And so I know with my, and sometimes grandparents have worked through some of their own things. And I saw that a little bit with my own dad as he became both of my parents. My mother was always very good with children, so it was less striking with her. But my dad worked hard. He worked a lot. He's always been kind of a man's man. And uh, to see him with my brother's children, to see him with the babies and delighting in the children, and it's just very different than the submarine commander that I got to know. Not that he was a hard person at all, but there was just sort of a comfort in his own skin and a comfort with the little ones, and just brought this beautiful quality out of him that I'm not sure my brother and I were able to bring out of him in the same way when he was quite a bit younger as we were growing up. So it's beautiful to see how God sort of gives the grandparents a second chance to exercise their hard-won wisdom over a generation of raising children, and then to exercise that with the little ones. And then, as you point out, that's edifying for the parents to see how the grandparents love them. And sometimes they create certain tensions as parents think that they want to raise their children different than their grandparents and keep the grandparents away from the children, or try to box them into how they're supposed to do things, and create some of those can create some of those little tensions as well that are part of the love that happens, that helps us all to grow as we stay in relationship and we work through certain things. The truth is usually in the middle. The grandparents have some wisdom that the parents can benefit from. The parents have some innovation and some insight that the grandparents wouldn't necessarily have had, and and that's how we sort of grow generationally, not just throwing out everything that came before us, but trying to incorporate as much as we can, and then also allowing new things to develop and incorporating those in organic ways. And so it's beautiful to see that dynamic unfold in families.
And to that point, the second chance element of it really makes me think about how maybe it's always been this way and I just didn't realize it, but it seems like second chances are the thing right now that at least in the business world that everyone is pushing. Your initial plan failed, so the word they use is we're pivoting to the second idea. And on the one hand, yes, it's nice to be able to have a backup plan and a second thought. But on the other hand, isn't it better to just go in knowing what you're going to do and do it well, which is what I push for? Not to say that I do things exactly the same way, but it's still the same emphasis. It's still the same concept of going through it. So it's not that you're loving differently or you went from some emotion that wasn't love and now trying to apply love. I can't really think of the right verbiage for what I'm trying to say there. But where I wanted to go with this was from the marriage perspective, that being grandparents, and try to pull it back to the saints that we were discussing here, one of the emphasis you want to talk about was them being married. And there's this mentality now with divorce being so common that I would just pivot to someone else who will be a better fit for my marriage. But as we're kind of discussing here, you change as you go through life. So it is natural that if you find someone who's a perfect fit for you when you're 20, that it will be a little bit different. Maybe not necessarily a bad fit, but a different fit than it is as you progress down life. And it strikes me that so many people just want to only live in what is perfect for me right now and disregard what the future of building something together with someone is, and having all of the shared experiences and building it the same way together. In my world, I see a lot of people that move a lot. So when you're moving all the time, on one hand, it's a traumatic point in some people's lives, especially if they get attached to a house. And it's a thing, it's not a person, so the relationship is obviously different. But even that can be traumatic. People changing cars can be a big deal for some people, and for some people, they don't care at all. And I bring this up because marriage isn't like that, where you can just go, okay, this was fun for a while. Now I'm going to go see if it'd be funner with someone else. And if not, I'll come back, but, don't count on me. And that seems to be the mentality that marriage is getting pushed upon now. And I think that that's a grave problem societally wise, that has ramifications that I think we're seeing the results of, but we have no idea how big this canyon of problems is. And it's just something that, I wanted to bring it back to marriage as you mentioned that with our saints.
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right. I think we're still discovering the ravages of divorce in our culture and what that is doing to individuals. I can certainly say in working with people, I work with a lot of people in spiritual direction. Of course, that's working with the heart, with the interior life. And so it's related to counseling in that sense. And so I get a glimpse into the inside of a lot of people. And I'll say some of the hardest things are divorce. I mean, there's a kind of instability that's created in the heart. There's a difficulty in believing that anybody can make a commitment. There's always some personalization of it, that if I had been different, my parents would have stuck together. These are generalizations, but it's true in so many cases, and the children are always the ones who suffer. Yeah. And again, there are, I also know situations where I would advise 100 times over that a couple separate. I mean, where a woman is in danger from her husband, for example, or where there's real neglect, abuse, where there's a real danger to the children, where there are situations like that. And I'm grateful that the law has allowed for divorce and people aren't just stuck in abusive situations. Certainly. Now, the children still suffer from that. And I know her parents who do a heroic job trying to overcome that. But one parent just can't do the job of two. In some cases, the grandparents are a great help in that. And children are able to experience back to that point of the ravages of divorce. And, what do you do? There are things that obviously could be worked through. There are marriages that could have been prevented to begin with because the people weren't really ready to make the commitment that was necessary. There are cases where there just isn't the foundation in faith. I mean, I always say when I do marriages, it's really a miracle that a man and a woman can live together for the rest of their lives. This is not obvious from looking at men and women, in my perspective, and it's a little bit of a miracle. And so the grace of the sacrament is really necessary. But then the couple needs to be disposed to receive that grace, and to try and enter into marriage without any religious foundation is also, I think, is fraught with problems and destined for failure. So all of that, and then when to have a society in which it's so normative that people are divorced, just none of the kind of societal pressures, cultural expectations are holding people together, and they're not surrounded by people who will say to them, "Hey, you got to fight through this. I'll stand with you. I'll help you out. Let's work through this together. There's an opportunity for growth, for conversion here," and you just don't have those kinds of influences. So all of that really mitigates against stability and commitment, and it's creates just so many problems. And then the impact on the children, and then their less uh, their lower willingness to get married, their difficulty staying married. It really propagates from one generation to the next. So it's a big problem, and I'm grateful for you, Joe, and your witness of faithful marriage and your commitment to your beautiful wife, and the fruitfulness of your marriage with your son, and a lot of those things are really a great witness for us.
And the one thing you said there is kind of the back theme or the backbone of everything we said. Maybe didn't emphasize it until the end, but every study that I've ever seen has highlighted this too, that stability is what people need. We've mentioned before, I used the term just going to autopilot. And that really is a form of stability. The thing that when we look at these studies that say what happens to the child during divorce, it's the upheaval of the stability and the fear that you might never actually walk in a solid building again, but it always might be crumbling. And having gone through a number of crumbling buildings where I didn't know if I could like fully walk on the floor, I didn't want to be there. And that's the prism that some people are put into their lives due to a lack of stability for a lot of different reasons. And then eventually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you just do activities that bring less stability into your life. So we're going to conclude today's episode on that, but just to think that how we can become more stable within ourselves, more loving of ourselves as a result of that, really does transmit to other people around us. That whether you realize it or not, at least I can count on that guy over there. And it might be something little or something small. Like every time I go to the gas station, they will have orange Gatorade. It's really a really weird starting point, but it could be something for someone. And just to go through there and think about how we can ourselves make our lives a little bit more stable. And as a result of making ourselves more stable, become better pillars for other people to lean on. So we thank everyone for listening. We will be with you again here next week, and we look forward to talking with you then.